All right, Live Youth Group, thanks for joining me here again on another Wednesday. And I've got bad news for you. This is going to be the last Wednesday that we get to do this video thing. Just kidding. That's great news because next Wednesday we are going to be back together again. And as I think everyone knows, because Lancaster County is going green, that kind of opens up opportunities for us. And so mark it on your calendars, July 1st. Details will come later, but July 1st is, far as I can tell, we're going to be getting back together, and so looking forward to it. What I can tell you though is that there's going to be no group hugging. We'll save that for another day, although I know you junior high boys, you just can't keep your hands off of each other, you little weirdos. But that's okay, I love weirdos too. I miss you guys, so I'm excited to see you. Second thing and last thing here real quick is that the whitewater rafting trip is happening, okay, July 3rd through the 5th, and so I think I have everybody signed up again. Remember, if you signed up the first time, that doesn't mean that you're signed up the second time. All right, so please, if you think you're unsure or if you didn't sign up again, let me know. Hit me up here on Instagram, email me, text, whatever. I need to know that, okay? And then again, if you're going on that trip, I'll let all those details come to you soon in an email as far as what you need to bring, when we're leaving, when we're coming back, and that kind of stuff. All right? Okay, we're getting back into the book of Habakkuk, right? Not Chewbacca's second cousin, but one of God's minor prophets, not because he's less significant or the message isn't important, but because the book in the Bible is small. It's only 3 chapters. And so last week we covered chapters 1 and 2. And this week we're going to cover the final chapter, number 3. But to remind you, Habakkuk's living in the nation of Judah, okay, the southern tribes there, prior to the Babylonian captivity. And in that period in Judah's history, things aren't going well. People are not living for God, they're not loving God. And so Habakkuk's witnessing what he calls out in the very beginning, injustice and violence and destruction, and it's just eating at his heart. It grieves his soul. And so what we're going to see is this back and forth between Habakkuk and God, and Habakkuk saying, God, what's going on here? Why aren't you disciplining these people? And God says, I am actually getting ready to discipline them. Babylon's going to come in, okay, and take all of you captive. And that is how I'm going to get my justice. And Habakkuk responds and goes, that doesn't make any sense. Babylon's worse off than we are. They're a wicked, wicked people. Why would you use them? And God says, Habakkuk, I know they're wicked people, and my ways don't always make sense to you, and they're going to get their justice too, but that's my plan. And then the verse that we're going to go back to real quick, because it's kind of a key verse for Habakkuk because of the idea, is Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4, where God says to Habakkuk, the righteous shall live by faith. And so that was where we ended last week. What does that look like for a righteous person to live by faith? And here in chapter 3, we're going to get a great answer to that question, because Habakkuk actually lives it out, and he puts it down on paper for us in a prayer. And what's unique about chapter 3 is that not that it's a prayer, but that it's also a psalm. And so you're going to see things in chapter 3 that you don't see anywhere else in the Bible. Nowhere, except for the Psalms, okay? Actually, if you look at the very end of chapter 3, you're going to see this little notation. It says, to the choir master with stringed instruments. That's the harp, all right? And so let's take a quick look at chapter 3 here in the next few minutes. But before we dive into verses, let me just give you the bigger context here. Chapter 3 could be broken up into 2 main parts. The first part, verses 2 through 15, are Habakkuk's view of God, essentially. And then verses 16 through 19 are Habakkuk's response despite everything else just kind of falling apart around him. Okay? All right, now let's get into it here. Remember, what does it look like for the righteous to live by faith? And the first thing is to remember how big and how awesome and magnificent God is. And we're going to see that in some of these verses. Let's go to this majesty or like majestic view of God with some sprinkle of fear on top. Let's look at verse 4. Habakkuk writes here, his brightness was like the light, rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. And so we see this big, infinitely big view of God, how awesome and, again, majestic he is. But he's also a God who's not to be trifled with or taken lightly, because he is powerful. And so when you stand on the opposite side, when you're the enemy of someone who's got this much authority, you do not want to cross him and you do not want to upset him. And so we've got this big view of God, but it's also kind of couched in the fact that he's not someone that we just buddy up to and, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to make a mistake there, because he's someone who is absolutely to be feared. And throughout the scriptures, we see that idea just kind of over and over again. In verses 8 and 9, I'm not going to read them, you can, but you're going to see these warrior type terms that give us a view of God as a warrior. So chariots, horses, bows, arrows, and again, that's just driving home or taking to another level this view of God that he's not to be taken lightly. But then moving down into verses 10 through 12, you're going to see Habakkuk recall these elements of creation. So the sun and the moon stood still in their place. In verse 10, the mountains saw you and writhed, the raging waters swept on. And so all of these elements of the world around Habakkuk, they are elements that God created. He is sovereign and supreme over all of creation, and he holds it all together. And Habakkuk's just reminding himself of that here in this prayer. And then in verse 13 is kind of this statement saying, God, I know what you said in chapters 1 and 2, and he's recalling those responses. And he says, you went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. And just remembering that God's justice, even though it always doesn't make sense to us, and the timing doesn't always work out like we want to, God is going to hold true to his promises, and he's going to come through. And so we see kind of Habakkuk come full circle there. But now let's jump into the second half of this prayer, and it's one that has some of the most powerful and even poetic verses in all of scriptures, and they're really, really great verses to cling to. Again, in such a season as this, where the world around us seems to be just falling apart in some ways, and we're not sure what's next. So let me read them. In verse 16, he says, I hear and my body trembles, my lips quiver at the sound, rottenness enters into my bones, and my legs tremble beneath me, because Babylon's coming in. But, he says, yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. So even though Babylon's going to come in, and that just makes Habakkuk quiver, he knows at the end of the day, they're going to have their day of reckoning too, because the day of the Lord is the one that's going to be the final day. Okay? And then verses 17 through 19, just really awesome verses. Habakkuk closes out with these strong statements. He says, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord, I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's, he makes me tread on high places. And so in this agricultural society, everything is falling apart. Nothing is blooming or blossoming. All of their flocks, all of their produce is just not producing. And so everything gets stripped away. And yet he's able to say, I will rejoice in the Lord, and I will take joy in the God of my salvation. The Lord is my strength. So 2 questions to close with. 1, is your view of God big enough? Because sometimes it's easy to think that God's just our buddy, like he's just going to help us through the day and make our life easier, and we forget that he is reigning supreme over all of these things, and he is to be held in high esteem, respected and feared in that light. And then 2, is your joy lying in the Lord? Because when everything else is stripped away, comforts, health, people, are you able to sustain that? And in this season, I hope you're able to say yes, just like Habakkuk was. Okay? All right. I love you. See you soon.